world, just war theory has increasingly been interpreted to say that the only injustice which can morally justify war is an act of aggression. In a world of nation-states, the modern world in which states are defined by territorial borders, it's argued that states characteristically act unjustly when they invade another nation's territory, when they commit an act of aggression and violate another state's territorial integrity and sovereignty. And so, modern versions of just war theory tend to focus on the proposal that the only just war in the modern world is a war of defense against aggression. Now, why should that be enough to meet the requirement of just cause? Why is a war of defense against aggression a just war? Why is that enough to justify the wholesale destruction of human life? What's characteristically appealed to here is the analogy with individual self-defense. That analogy between collective defense against aggression and individual self-defense plays a very important role in modern moral thinking about war, and we need to look at that now. Sorry, I seem to have skipped. Was I on the wrong slide or previously? Anyway, I hope you can follow me. How does the self-defense analogy work then? You remember our starting question was, how can it ever be right to take another human life? How can it ever be right to kill another human being? Now, most people, not necessarily everyone, but most people, I think, would say that there's one obvious exception to the principle that it's wrong ever to kill another human being, and that's when that other person is threatening your own life. We can put this plausibly in the language of rights. The value of each individual life can be expressed in the idea of everyone having a right to life. But, it can then be said, if someone is threatening me, if someone is threatening my life, then I have the right to defend my life. That's part of what having a right to life means, that you have a right to defend that life against someone who's trying to destroy it. And if the only way to defend my life, it's said, is to kill my attacker, if I can't reason with him or disable him, if the only way in which I can protect my own life is by killing my attacker, then if I have a right to life, then I also have the right to kill him. I say him because I imagine it usually is. And the reason why I have the right to kill him is that I am the innocent victim and he is not. As the innocent victim, I have a right to life and I have a right to defend myself by killing my attacker. My attacker is not an innocent victim and therefore he does not have the right to kill me. That's the self-defense, individual self-defense analogy that's appealed. And the argument then goes on, and this is the way in which the analogy is used. The argument goes, it's the same with countries. If a country is attacked, then it too has the right to defend itself. That analogy may already look dodgy to you, and I'm going to suggest in a moment that it doesn't stand, but I want first of all to at least try to bring out its plausibility. It's an analogy that was, I think, often used when conscientious objectors were brought before tribunals, for example, and they were asked, what would you do if someone was attacking you? Or I think more often it was, what would you do if someone is attacking your sister? Or what would you do if someone is attacking your mother? Or, there's always some female relative of some sort or another. The 20th century British intellectual Lytton Strachey, a member of the Bloomsbury group, said, I should try to interpose myself between them. But the implication of the question was, sometimes that may not be enough. And the implication was then, if you think it's right to defend yourself or your mum or your sister by, if necessary, killing the attacker, then surely you should think the same thing about your country. You should be prepared to fight and to kill to defend your country. And that's why the implication of the analogy is there is a right to resist collective as well as individual aggression. And that's why, so the argument goes, there is a right to kill enemy soldiers in war because they, like the individual attacker, are not innocent victims. Because they are fighting, they, like the individual attacker, have lost their right not to be killed, and that's why defense against aggression is a just cause, and why it can justify taking life in a war of defense against aggression. You can see also how that analogy serves also to back up jus in bello and the principle of non-combatant immunity. Again, the idea here is soldiers, by fighting, have lost their right not to be killed, but civilians haven't. Civilians are innocent. They've not done anything which would deprive them of their right to life, so they retain their basic human right to life. And even if their country is at war, civilians must not be killed. This idea that targeting civilians is wrong, is especially wrong because it's targeting innocent non-combatants, is very strong. We referred to it in the last session. And it carries with it then the converse. If you think that there's something especially wrong about targeting and killing innocent non-combatants, then that carries with it the implication that combatants, on the other hand, are not innocent, and that's why they are legitimate targets. And that's what the analogy with individual self-defense is doing then, both in underpinning the theory of jus ad bellum and the theory of jus in bello. Now, I've tried to present the whole theory, including the self-defense analogy, in as plausible a way as possible and in as sympathetic a way as possible. And I do want to say that it's a serious ethical approach to the fundamental moral dilemma of war. It acknowledges the heavy moral price that has to be paid in any decision to go to war, but at the same time it's realistic, and it recognises that in a harsh world, war may sometimes be the only solution. So it's a position that we need to take seriously, not just dismiss. It's a position that whose strength we need to recognise. Nevertheless, I do want to go on to say that there are problems with it, insurmountable problems in the end. I want to focus on two in particular. First of all, as you may already have inferred, I do want to suggest that, appealing though the analogy with individual self-defense may be, in the end, it's unsatisfactory. You can see why it looks attractive, and I've said why modern versions of just war theory rely heavily on it, but in the end, it's too weak to do the job that it's put to do in just war theory. The fundamental problem is this, I think, that in the case of individual self-defense, what gives you the right to kill your attacker is that your attacker is responsible for threatening your life. But the analogy fails because soldiers in war very rarely carry individual responsibility in that way. You may say they have some responsibility, but it falls way short of the kind of responsibility carried by the individual attacker in the case of individual self-defense. Soldiers typically are obeying orders. Typically, the decisions are made by governments. The responsibility is carried by governments, not by individuals. Obviously, in modern wars, most soldiers, or very often, at any rate, very often soldiers are conscripts. They have no choice, and they're not responsible for the decisions that are made about whether or not to go to war. Even if they're not conscripts, even if they're people who've signed up for 5 years of their life or whatever, still they don't carry individual responsibility for the decisions that are made about war and peace and aggression and defence in the way in which the individual attacker does in the analogy of individual self-defence. So just war theory, quite generally, relies crucially on, I think, a sharp contrast between combatants who are liable to be killed because they're culpable, because they're fighting and because therefore they're responsible for what they're doing, and on the other hand, innocent civilians who are simply ordinary human beings with the basic human right to life. Though there may be some important contrast there, the just war theory relies on too sharp a distinction between combatants who've lost their right to life and non-combatants who haven't. The fact is, in the real world, that the combatants killed in war are often no more responsible for what's going on than are the civilians. The second problem with the theory, the second problem with the tradition, I think, is that it says that war cannot be fought justly if it's fought by killing civilians. That's in the jus in bello part. But the fact is that almost all modern wars are fought in that way, often with very large civilian casualties. This is not just a matter of chance, it's not just a matter of, as it were, the decline of moral standards in war fighting. It's an integral part of modern war fighting strategies. It's a consequence of the reliance on aerial bombing. Sometimes that reliance on aerial bombing is quite deliberate, as in the Second World War. Both sides in the Second World War, as you know, both the Allies and the Axis powers deliberately targeted centres of population as a way of undermining the morale of the civilian population. So clearly, the requirement of non-combatant immunity was violated by both sides in that war. But that's not just an isolated example. And even if the targeting of civilian areas is not deliberate, still a typical war-fighting strategy in the modern world is to start with the bombing of command and control centres of the enemy. The bombing of government buildings in cities, the bombing of power supplies, the transport infrastructure, roads, railways, and so on. We've seen this in the way in which the war against Iraq began, and we're seeing it to some extent in the case of Libya. So the fact is that in modern wars, it seems, civilian casualties are inevitable. Now that's sometimes excused as collateral damage. That phrase was used in one of the questions that was put to Professor Galton before the break. That phrase, collateral damage, was caused, I think, was formulated, I think, by the American military, but it's a modern version of, again, a traditional Christian doctrine, the so-called doctrine of double effect. The idea of double effect, to try and put it as simply as possible, is the idea that though it's wrong deliberately to kill people, if the deaths that result are an accidental side effect, if they're unintended, then even though they may be foreseeable, such deaths may be morally acceptable. The idea, death may be acceptable if it's an unintended, though foreseen, side effect. Now, the doctrine of double effect is controversial, and we could debate it at great length. And I do think that in some cases, it has some degree of plausibility. I probably know more than that. There's a case to be made for it. But I do think also that in this context, in the context of modern methods of war fighting and the inevitability of civilian casualties, I think that the idea of double effect, or the idea of collateral damage, is an evasion of responsibility. If the bombing of populated areas and the resultant civilian deaths, if these are an integral part of the way in which the war is fought,